It's the 1st of March 2021. I'm speaking to senior journalist for the Daily Mail, David Rose, and we're going to be talking about what's been going on in the media over the last year. And of all the interviews that I've done, David, I think this is the one people are really going to be so desperate for. They're gagging to hear from someone like you. They really are. Tell us a little bit about your experience and your role at the Daily Mail. I think you are quite close to the editorial team and you do have quite a lot of influence, but you're freelance. Can you just tell us a little bit about your experience as a journalist and what it's like working for the Daily Mail?
Well, I've been a journalist for a very long time, nearly 40 years now. And I've worked for The Guardian, I've worked for The Observer, I've worked for the BBC, and I worked for the Mail on Sunday for about 12 and a half years. And I moved over to the Daily Mail as a contract freelance, as I was on the Mail on Sunday in September. Now, that means that, I have a close relationship with the Daily Mail, but I'm not on the staff. So I have a renewable annual contract for, so many articles per year. And my main brief is to write investigative pieces on a range of subjects, really. If they like the idea, they'll publish the article. So I've been around a long time, and I've generally tended to do those kind of investigative stories. But I do think one thing I've noticed very much in the past year in this pandemic is the culmination or the latest developments in a trend that I have observed for many years. And I think it's just getting worse and worse all the time. And what I'm talking about is the continual control or attempt to control the news by those in power. And I mean this in the most basic nuts and bolts way. When I started out as a reporter on The Guardian in the 1980s, you would ring up a Whitehall press office, a department, and you could ask a question and you would get an answer. I know that sounds remarkable, very basic, but this has become a very rare thing. When I first started out on The Guardian, I was on the sort of race, relations and immigration beat. And there were various articles or stories that would cross my desk, often on the immigration side, where families couldn't be united or somebody was being threatened with deportation and people were supporting them. And often these were heartbreaking stories. And for a very long time, when I first started doing this, and for years before, the policy at the Home Office would be, if you rang up about a particular case, you just get a 2-line answer: we do not discuss individual cases. Great, job done, off we go. So very simple to just put that in. And then Douglas Hurd became Home Secretary. And he said, well, this is a silly policy. Let's look at these questions in detail. So you'd ring up and you'd speak to the same press officer who previously had given you that, that brush off. And you'd say, well, this is a question about so-and-so, and this is the case number and blah, 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 blah. He said, right, I'll come back to you in an hour and a half. And they would come back with detailed rebuttals. And they'd say, well, your facts are wrong here because, not always, however, sometimes, and I know this sounds extraordinary, they came back with, this looks like a really bad case. Yes, you can tell your readers, we're looking into this. Now, I know this sounds quite extraordinary, but I can directly claim credit for actually sorting out several immigration cases where, because they got a reply, an approach from a journalist, the Home Office looked again at a case, and without even having to go to court, they thought, oh God, we got this one wrong. And the decision was changed. Now, later on, I became crime correspondent of The Guardian, and the relationship between The Guardian and the Metropolitan Police had been pretty difficult for a long time. There've been things like the Wapping dispute, and then nationally, obviously, the miners' strike and this sort of thing. And then in came this new commissioner, Peter Imbert, and he just said, right, we're going to have a different approach. We're going to be open to the media, and that includes the media who are often critical of us. And suddenly, you could talk to coppers. You'd be given briefings. They'd answer questions. And if there wasn't, the basic rule was that if there wasn't a pressing operational reason why you couldn't divulge information, well, then they would. And, Imbert, very soon after taking office, had commissioned this report by a management consultancy called Wolf Olins, which had revealed that the Met culture at the time was pretty ugly, full of racism and sexism and so on. And he wanted to change it. He was a genuine reformer. And he thought, well, actually, shining daylight into dark corners is one of the best ways to achieve this. So suddenly, it was a sort of collaborative and cooperative relationship. Well, that continued for 5 glorious years. And then the start of what I see as the slippery slope to where we are now came around 1992, when Peter Imbert was replaced as Metropolitan Commissioner by Paul Condon. And his Director of Communications, who was a wonderful man called Mike Granite, was replaced by somebody else. I won't name that because I don't want to directly accuse individuals here. But I always remember ringing up for a particular, help on a story, expecting that I would be just given some access and told some answers. And his new Director of Communications came on the line. I explained what I wanted, and she said, "What's in it for us?" And I felt completely chilled. I'd been so naive, and I said, "Well, this is a democracy, and you're supposed to be policing by consent. And what's in it for us? I can't see there's anything in it for us. We're not going to help." And that was the moment, for me, everything changed. Now, not long after that, we had Alistair Campbell becoming the head of communications for Tony Blair, who, of course, at that stage was still leader of the opposition. And Campbell became notorious for doing things that, up until that point, had been seen as very much crossing a line, something that people dealing with the media just didn't do. And what I mean is, if he didn't like a story, even if it was true, he would ring up reporters, often very senior reporters, at national broadcasting organisations and newspapers, and yell at them. And he would say, "How could you do this? You've got this wrong. This is monstrous." And what people also began to find is that they were being blacklisted, that they'd be given no access for perhaps months at a time. Now, if you're a specialist reporter, not having access is a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And in a pandemic, if you're a health reporter, not having access, if you're a broadcaster, to hospitals, to doctors, to nurses, people to put on the screen, pictures on which to fill the screen, you're in big trouble. And even if you're a print reporter, not having any of that access, being denied access to briefings, information, and so forth, it's a very deadly weapon. Now, I'm not, thankfully, a specialist reporter any longer. It's years since I was. But I have covered stories to do with this pandemic. And I've had direct experience of things that I just would not have believed until a few years ago. So I did a story about procurement in the PPE procurement in Whitehall. And as you know, there's been a lot of murk surrounding this. After an initial tremendous shortage, we've ended up buying far too much. A lot of it is actually being stored in warehouses in China because there's nowhere to store it here. It's going to go off, it's going to reach its use-by date long before it's used. And chums of the government have got lucrative deals purely because they are chums of the government. And I actually broke the story about the so-called fast track or VIP channel, which gave people access to the procurement process. And according to the National Audit Office, a couple of weeks after I wrote my story, people with this VIP channel access were 10 times as likely to get contracts. Anyhow, I wrote a big article about this, and it named a particular official in the Cabinet Office who played a leading role in this. Next morning, Saturday morning, 8 o'clock, I turn on my iPad and there's a text: "Call so-and-so senior communications officer from NHS England." So, waited a bit, had some breakfast, and called this individual. I'm not going to say his or her name. But I was yelled at for about 20 minutes, told that I got this completely wrong, that this individual had played no part whatsoever in procurement. Well, I was able to muster, a lot of evidence within an hour or two that this was actually not the case, that the individual concerned had played a leading role in procurement right through the crucial early weeks of the pandemic from March last year onwards. Eventually, the communications person did write an email of complaint to the managing editor of the Daily Mail. I presented my evidence. We sent it back saying, well, sorry, we're not printing a correction because the story is true. Heard nothing more. A couple of months go by. And then I'm asked, would I do a story about a vaccine centre? They were just starting up the big vaccine centres that are now obviously doing very well. Would you go and talk to people getting their vaccines, talk to people giving out the jabs, just write a nice little colour feature? Sure. Anyway, all week I had to talk to the same individual with whom I'd had this run-in, who'd been yelling at me on the phone. And eventually that individual made it impossible for me to get the access I needed to write this article. And having made it very clear I needed to get this done by Thursday, finally they offered me a slot at sort of lunchtime on Friday, hours away from where I live, and it just wasn't going to work. So when that became clear, I said, well, I think it's a real shame that you decided not to do that. You've lost an opportunity here. Nice, colourful piece, would have been, good publicity for the vaccine rollout. I can't see, why you've turned your noses up. And then the truth came. Well, if you think we're going to forgive you for that article about NHS procurement, you've got another thing coming. We could have ruined your career. Do you realise? But we just decided to leave it alone. I'm like, what? Now, this is comms management 2021 style. It is yell at people, get your way, bully, deny access. And there's another aspect to it. As I said at the beginning of this rather long peroration, when I started out 40 odd years ago, you'd ring up a Whitehall department, you'd ask a question, and often you'd actually just get a simple answer. And it could be a really basic question, how many police officers are there in Lincolnshire, for the sake of argument? And they'd tell you. Now, ask any question you want, no matter how soon, how long before your deadline. And you never get an answer. So what happens is you ask a question. I asked a question last week. How is it that an Australian company, CTM, has got this contract, very lucrative contract, for the for the hotel quarantines at Heathrow? All the people coming in who have to be quarantined, all the bookings are managed by this company, Australian company. Now, it just so happens that the CEO of this company gave an interview to an Australian newspaper in which he said that the reason he got the contract was that he'd had a phone call from someone in Boris Johnson's office. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? So I asked the Department of Health and Social Care, why did this company get the contract? An answer? No. You get this bland reply. We can tell you that we award contracts on the basis that we are the best thing since sliced bread, and we are very, very careful. And yes, on background, not for quotation, on background, yes, it's true that we gave this company a contract. Great. That really answers the question, doesn't it? And this is what happens all the time. You can ask any questions you want, the most detailed, nitty-gritty questions involving policy, involving facts, involving details, and you just get these little policy statements that amount to, we are the best thing since sliced bread, now go away and leave us alone. But here's the thing, you get them at the last possible moment, because these little bland statements, they're all cleared by ministers or their special advisors. The press officers themselves aren't allowed even to answer these basic questions anymore, not that they actually answer the questions. It all goes up to the SPADs and the ministers. So we're in this situation where you have this vicious control of information, of messaging, through denial of access, through aggression, through refusal to answer questions. So poking that opaque level of secrecy, especially in a story as critical as the pandemic, where the state has assumed so much more power than it's ever had before, is quite difficult. Sorry, that was a very long speech.
No, not at all. It broke up a little bit at the end there. This is fascinating. Oh. This is what people really desperately want to hear. This is the truth. This makes sense. But then there's a part of me that thinks, well, it's going to be interesting to see the response to this interview from the likes of these individuals who've bullied you, whether it's going to be more difficult for you. But I just want to know, why do you need them, really? Why do you need access? Why don't you just send someone in with a mobile? There's lots of citizen journalists out there. Or why do you need access?
I'm lucky.
Because they're bullying you. They are the ones in control. They want to control the message. You're not in control of the message, are you? They're controlling the message.
Well, I'm very lucky. I'm very fortunate. I'm in a very privileged position. I don't need access. If they never give me access, and I assume, generally speaking, that they won't, okay, that's what I expect. But the control of the message with others, it is extraordinary. Imagine if you work for the BBC. Some people have felt, and I have to say I'm one of them, that the BBC has been relentless in its depiction of misery and horror through this pandemic. And it's basically an extension of those government advertisements, which are still around. Basically, look her in the eye and tell her that you went to a rave last week or whatever it is. Not that I don't think many people are going to raves, but it's constantly. It's just like wartime. It is a kind of war here, and just as in a war, the BBC has become effectively a propaganda arm of the government. But if you're a BBC reporter, especially if you're a health reporter, imagine the pressure on you not to dissent. Imagine if you're, Hugh Pym or Fergus Walsh, and you go along to some hospital having been given access, and you're filming yet another intensive care unit with heartbreaking scenes of people choking to death and doctors at the ends of their tethers. And, I don't detract from any of that. These are people who have performed heroically for an extraordinarily long time. But, are you going to take the risk of, for example, running a prominent story saying, well, we've all been told that this is this most deadly infection, but actually it's possible that there's a cheap generic drug out there called ivermectin, which might, if the data from trials that have been done in some parts of the world proves to be accurate, actually reduce this infection genuinely to something more like a seasonal influenza. You won't take that risk because that's not the message that you're wanting to put out there at this moment, it seems to me. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I resist conspiratorial thinking, and I'm very wary of hyping, one piece of data when, there's an awful lot of very confusing, conflicting data out there. But what you're seeing in certainly broadcasting channels, and to some extent in many newspapers, is the reflecting of an incredibly authoritarian, relentless messaging campaign from central government. And I think at a time when the state has assumed the powers that it has done, that's very dangerous.
And I know you haven't got too much longer. Just one last question. I have seen some media organisations smearing individuals, such as Professor Martin Kulldorff from Harvard's medical school, who was part of the Great Barrington Declaration, and also the BBC as well, Mariana Spring. It seems like they're out on a smear campaign. Why would they be doing that? Why would they? That's not, to me, that's not journalism.
Well, certainly I've read articles, seen things that have made me incredibly uncomfortable. And, the fact is that a lot of people have got a lot of things wrong in the pandemic. Scientists and doctors have said things at some stages which have proven not to be true. And yet, there is this polarization. So early on, Sweden decided not to have lockdowns. It would appear that their chief state epidemiologist, Dr. Anders Tegnell, was a little over-optimistic in saying that he thought that Sweden had reached a level of herd immunity by the end of the summer, and therefore there wouldn't be a second wave. When then a second wave of infection did start building in Sweden, the absolute schadenfreude, the joy that some commentators had, see, Sweden is suffering too. Except, although it's true that there was perhaps some over-optimism by Anders Tegnell in the summer, Sweden's second wave has been markedly less severe than the UK's. It started to fall without a lockdown at precisely the same time as the UK's did with a lockdown. There are still all sorts of open questions. And what's also true is that lots of people who made very pessimistic predictions were shown to be wrong. If you take Neil Ferguson's team from Imperial and apply their model to Sweden, there should have been, I think they were predicting 80,000 deaths when there's been, I believe, well under 10,000 deaths. Lots of people have got things wrong. But on one side of this argument, somebody says something that turns out not to have been borne out by events. And the pylon is staggering. It's like the mob is going to tear this person limb from limb. See, they got this wrong. How can we ever trust a word they say or write ever again? Well, the truth is, as I say, lots of people got lots of things wrong. Some things have been got triumphantly right. And the British vaccine programme is a stellar example of that. But, it seems like debate itself is off limits. To accept that there are grey areas, to accept there are nuances, to accept that balancing the collateral damage, never mind to the economy, but to health, that has been engendered by lockdowns, by people not seeking treatment for other conditions. I read an article in the Times this morning. Huge rise in oral cancers feared because of people not going to the dentist for checkups. Well, you know, I have a close relative who has been battling an oral cancer for many years. It is the most awful, awful experience. Late diagnosed oral cancer is one of the most miserable sentences that any human being can undergo. If there's going to be a rise in oral cancers diagnosed at a late stage because of people not going to the dentist, because of lockdowns, well, you know, this is something that is reasonable to factor in when we debate these issues. And yet, in large parts of the media, it seems that it's off limits.
Absolutely. And I'm sure a lot of these health correspondents, like you say, are frustrated. And you've really opened our eyes to that, David. And I thank you for that, because it has been the social media camp and the mainstream media camp, and there's been suspicion, and it's just been like, what's really going on? And you've helped, I think, you've given us food for thought, 100%, to think about all these different issues. And thank you for coming and talking to the public about it, because it's going to help them, I think, try and understand a little bit more about what they're watching and why it's, you know, things like ivermectin aren't being discussed.
Can I just say one more thing?
Of course you can.
Having said all that, you know, there are journalists in absolutely mainstream positions, including specialist journalists, who you said earlier on in this interview that I was brave. I'm not brave, because, you know, if I never write another story, anything to do with COVID again, it really isn't going to matter very much to my own career. You know, I'll find other things to write about. But people who do have to write about medicine, people who do have to write about health, there are some really shining exceptions to those, you know, to those I'm implicitly criticizing, who have produced, you know, very brave stories, who have dug underneath the surface, who have challenged orthodoxy, and who have not participated in pylons. I mean, I think, for example, of Deborah Cohen on Newsnight, who has done, I think, a magnificent job, and there are a number of others. The Mail on Sunday health section actually has been incredible, and pointing out, for example, at a very early stage, the misery that was taking place in care homes. You know, they really have produced remarkable coverage for which they deserve to win, you know, a bunch of awards. So, you know, it's very difficult to operate in this environment, but there are those who've managed it, and I, you know, take my hat off to them.
I get emails all the time from whistleblowers or people that have got this story or seen that or something on social media. Do you get that all the time as journalists? Just my last question. What do you do? How do you deal with the public who are sharing stuff that they've seen on BitChute or YouTube, or, you know, things that have frightened them? Do you get many emails from the public?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I get emails from the public who want me to investigate, you know, a story that they have a lot, but I've not really, maybe because I don't have a sort of big, you know, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not a very active social media person, and you know, I think this is the first time I've done a YouTube interview, so maybe that's why not too many people seem to get in touch with me with that sort of thing.
I see a lot of panic and anxiety from the people that contact me and comment, and they just feel that, you know, these ID cards are coming in and vaccine passports, and they want a media brand that's going to take them on this journey where they can trust you guys to put forward the facts, to present the facts, and to allow debates. And you know, I have seen the Daily Mail do that, and I've seen you do that, David. And from everyone that's contacted me and for the followers of this channel, I want to say thank you, and you know, keep it up. Just keep it up. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish the interview?
Well, you know, my fondest hope is that as we come out of this pandemic, we will, as a society, and that includes the media, it includes politicians, it includes the civil service, it includes every institution really, that we will have, you know, the wherewithal and the courage to look carefully at, you know, what has happened here. I mean, the fact is, you know, most of us as journalists, we cover big events in the world, but they don't really affect us directly that much. You know, as I said, I've been a journalist for 40 years. I've covered some very big stories. I've been present at some remarkable events, but they haven't, generally speaking, impacted on my own life, and certainly not for many months at a time. We've all been through something here, very profound, very searing, that probably will affect certainly the next few years of our lives, and maybe for those of us who are a bit older, the rest of our lives and our children's lives. And I just hope we have the courage to really stand back and try to understand the things that have happened in this extraordinary year and beyond, and you know, look at the bad things that were done in the name of fighting COVID, as well as the good. And I'm not at all sure that we will have that courage. I'm not at all sure that those who want to avoid criticism, who are perhaps feeling that they have quite a lot to lose from scrutiny, my fear is that they will continue to dictate the terms of the debate and suppress it.
Well, then the invitation is there for other journalists like yourself to come and talk to me, and I'm sure there'll be others to expose what's really going on, because we, the public, really do want to know, and you've given us the opportunity to understand. It's not as simple as I think a lot of people think it is, you know, how communications and media works. And I'm here to, you know, if any other journalists want to speak to me, that's what my channel is here for. Thank you ever so much, David. You enjoy the rest of your day. I really appreciate you talking to us.
My pleasure. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.